Sure, well, you have been remarkably accurate with your analysis and predictions, especially covering Ukraine. You have said that the war will likely end with Russia controlling all of eastern Ukraine, if not all of Ukraine, and we're starting to see a more accurate picture emerge in the media about what's really happening. So, can you summarize what you believe will happen next in Ukraine and why it's important to ordinary Americans? Yeah, well, I think it is very important for Americans to know the truth, and the truth has been very unpopular for quite a while. I don't want to cover too much history, but this war has been brewing for well over a decade. Some people would argue for at least 20 to 25 years because of the unwillingness in the West to look at the reality that the way the map is drawn of Ukraine, it is inaccurate, frankly. There are Ukrainians through Ukrainians, but they did not live in Crimea, which has never been part of Ukraine, and most of the area that we call the Donbass, the Donetsk Basin, is really Russian. The people that live there are Russian. And the easy way is to go back and look at the electoral maps showing how people voted over the last previous elections. You see that the East is overwhelmingly voting in favor of the pro-Russian candidate, and the West, which is on the other side of the Dnieper River, is usually voting overwhelmingly for the anti-Russian candidate, whoever that happens to be. So, there was always a need to address this, and I had argued for a plebiscite. Other people argued for it. I also always felt very strongly that it was in Ukraine's interest to be a neutral state, that it could be much like Austria and could profit enormously from its neutrality. This, of course, was sabotaged by first the Bush administration, then subsequently Obama, and I think that Trump was subverted by his own Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense and his entire national security team, who all wanted to press ahead with this expansion of and incorporate Ukraine. So, I think President Trump was left sort of standing there without anybody supporting him and then found himself out of office. And it wasn't long thereafter that Putin gave up because he said there's no one I can talk to. There's no one who will negotiate with me. I'm left no choice. Because what we did after 2014 was build this enormous Ukrainian military power, and it was designed to attack Russia, frankly, from eastern Ukraine. Ukrainians said they wanted to get back Crimea, we said fine. And they wanted to punish the Russians living in the East for being Russians and not converting to become 100% Ukrainians, speaking Ukrainian, and so forth, so on. So bottom line, you should get this war, and from the very beginning, I think Putin made some miscalculations. He thought that if he demonstrated how serious he was and his country was about growing to Russia and eastern Ukraine, that we would pay attention to him. Well, we did, but we decided to double down on the threat that we were creating, and his great fear was that in addition to this Ukrainian army, that of course, theater ballistic missiles would show up that would put his entire nuclear deterrent, as well as all these major cities, at risk. So, he marched in, and initially, it was a very cautious approach designed to do as little damage as possible, kill as few people as possible, and it took really almost until the summer to figure out there's nobody out there. Nobody's going to talk to us. Nobody's going to negotiate. We're stuck. We're going to have to change our entire approach, and so we go into this long-haul approach, which is basically a 30-month plan for a 30-month war. That's what he adopted in the summer. We've had this massive Russian military build up to the point now where we have what Biden and his supporters said he didn't want, which is this large and powerful Russian military power sitting on NATO's eastern border. In other words, he went in theoretically to protect NATO, and he got the opposite. And NATO is rapidly falling apart. And we see from these leaked documents that have come out the tremendous unity inside the NATO alliance, and for your purposes, I'm sure your listeners know that one of the fatal mistakes that we made was to assume that Russia was this economically weak backward power. I think someone put it was McCain who said, Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons. That's right, Blake discovered they could not be more wrong. So Russia has an abundance of resources and energy, of course, which makes it the perfect partner for China that needs all of that to continue to sustain economic expansion, and we've ended up on the wrong side in the sense that we're suffering economically. Our European allies are suffering very, very acutely from this war and from all these self-defeating sanctions. Well, I was actually going to go there next. In Ukraine, we seem to have made financial sanctions the centerpiece of our military strategy. Weaponizing the dollar and economic sanctions were a useful weapon decades ago, but the world has evolved to really neutralize them. So, what occasions do Western financial sanctions failing so visibly have in the geopolitical sphere here? Well, keep in mind that for many, many decades, we've used our command of the World Bank and other financial centers because effectively the dollar dominates everything. We not only pass on our debt to others by compelling everybody else to use the dollar, but the institutions, global institutions, use the dollar because it's convenient. And what we've done is we've effectively bullied so many people for so long that many are saying, well, Russia's got a point. China's got a point. Why should we do business constantly in the dollar? Now, this doesn't mean that the so-called reserve currency is going to go away instantly. But I think it's in serious trouble. So this de-dollarization is very serious at this point. We shouldn't underestimate it. But I think we brought it on ourselves. If you constantly beat people over the head with, as you say, this weapon, this financial weapon, eventually they come back and say, we've had it. I mean, people living in Honduras or Costa Rica or Southeast Asia and Thailand are being told, if you want our assistance, our support, then grow these crops. Crops, imagine that. Being told what crops you will grow and so forth. It's gotten really out of hand. The sanctions are just another manifestation of this, and frankly, all the sanctions that we've imposed on Russia turned out to be undercut anyway. So, the oil and the gas, along with rare earths and every other conceivable mineral and foodstuff, all those things are seeping out one way or the other. It's kind of as if you pass a law in the United States, and it's a fundamentally flawed law, whatever it happens to be, it's a law that everyone opposes, and people really don't want to obey it. Ultimately, what happens, it's meaningless because over time, the police decide not to enforce it because they can't. Well, that's largely what's happened to us and our financial dominance on the planet. Well, you know, something I've talked about many times on this show is that every fiat currency has failed. Some lasted months, some a century, but all have failed. And we depegged from gold in the 1970s. We continue to print these paper promises, spend more than we take in. We're net consumers, whereas all these countries that we have tensions with are net producers. So, where does the dollar go from here? You said it won't lose its reserve status very quickly, but did these sanctions accelerate losing that status? Yes. Yeah, I think they contribute enormously to it. You know, I really wish that I could drag my son into this discussion. He's a brilliant financial analyst, and he's someone I pay attention to, and I've listened to him for years, which is why I'm heavily invested in digital currency, because he's pointed out that we're really on a path to one of two destinations right now. One destination, of course, is, well, the Fed will just print money, and that's the widespread assumption. They'll continue to print and print and print. What's to stop us? Well, there are a lot of things that can stop you from printing more money, not the least of which is something called hyperinflation. We've been down that road before. We could turn to the Weimar Republic in the interwar period. They talk about Argentina. We could go to any number of different places and find it. So that's one destination. The other destination is that at some point, no one's buying your treasuries. And when nobody's buying your treasuries, and you can no longer buy them all up. And even worse, other countries begin to dump your treasuries. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. You have to restructure your debt. It's called defaulting. Now, people say, oh, we've never defaulted. Well, that's a lot of nonsense. In 32 and 34, we did. We called it restructuring our debt. Now, restructuring the debt is very painful, as you know, and as my son points out to me all the time, credit's going to dry up, and you're going to have to live without credit for some period of time. I mean, it is going to be hell on earth for people that are accustomed to essentially relentless financial expansion. But the other problem we face that no one ever discusses is this financialization of our economy. That's right. What do we build? What do we produce? Well, we produce a lot of military equipment and technology, but there's a problem with that. It's not much return on investment, which is why anybody with any sense, like President Eisenhower, was always trying to keep defense expenditures to what he considered to be the acceptable minimum. Why would you want to maintain the security of your country? He wasn't interested in being the policeman of the world, obviously, and he didn't like all of these alliances, but he set them up in a way that made them unambiguously defensive, and when, for instance, Austria wanted to become neutral, he welcomed it. In fact, Eisenhower said we should try to neutralize more countries in Europe because we simply can't defend them all. Well, his wise words and wise counsel have been largely abandoned. So now, then here's the last problem. In addition to having sort of built the empire that we can't afford, much like the British did, and then run ourselves into bankruptcy, where do you put your store of wealth? How do you preserve it? And I think digital currency is one of those options, and in fact, it may. I shouldn't make these kinds of predictions, but of course, John Kenneth Galbraith once said that economic forecasting exists to make astrologers look professional, so I feel like I can make an economic forecast since I think Galbraith was right. I have a feeling that digital currency over time may well replace most of the fiat currency. Do you think that Bitcoin could serve as a global reserve currency? I don't know. I mean, I'm in over my head, and everyone out there will say, well, you didn't go to the Wharton School. That's true. Now, my grandfather went to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Both of my grandfather went to Penn, but it doesn't help me. I didn't. I'm not a business school graduate, although I have lots of people telling me not to worry about it, but that's never, that's another issue. But the bottom line is, I don't know, but I think digital currency that cannot be controlled and manipulated through a central banking system is something that's very, very appealing to people. Now, beyond that, I don't know. I wish I could make more profound predictions for you, but I can't. But I think that's real. I mean, isn't everyone sick of the banking system's manipulation of wealth and power? How many years have we gone through this? Somebody says, well, when the Fed was established in the United States, in the intervening years, we're down to 10% the dollars at 10% of what it was worth in what? 1911? It's incomprehensible. So, I think there's a desire for something else, there's no question about it, and I think digital currency has a bright future. Beyond that, I can't say too much, right? I definitely agree that we need a parallel system. I think a lot of the policymakers use Bitcoin as an invisibility cloak. They make it look like the threat when actually they don't want to admit that their own policies are what got us here. And if we lose the dollar's reserve status, we won't be able to sustain these trillion-dollar deficits, part of which go to fund the military, right? So, things will need to change. The military budget will have to come down to something reasonable for the size of our economy. I know that right now from sources within the military, they're still basing budgets on 2% CPI and not accounting for the increase in inflation. Entitlements will be affected. So, how do you see this really playing out? Well, there are 3 things that your viewers need to understand. First of all, money into defense does not necessarily produce capability on the other end. Just spend money doesn't equal capability. We spend far too much for what we get in most cases. In some cases, we spend a great deal, and we do get a good return on investment. I think that's particularly true in surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, platforms, and capabilities, but in many other areas, we simply don't. So, that's the first problem. The second problem is that, your current military establishment remains tragically a brilliant tribute to the Second World War. We're still building surface fleets around aircraft carrier battle groups. We're still fielding large, ponderous army divisions that are too heavy to move, too heavy to lift. But even worse, the world doesn't fight that way anymore, and that's one of the things that we have to pay attention to what's been happening in Ukraine because it fundamentally changes the way you look at things. That's a huge problem. And then you've got the threat inflation industry. You want to keep this monstrous military establishment running, and you keep insisting it's vitally necessary because if anything isn't spent for 10 cents less or 10 billion less, you're at risk of being conquered and overrun and destroyed by whom? Well, we go back to Russia. Russia presents no substantial threat to us unless, of course, we decide to attack Russia. They have an enormous nuclear arsenal. We have an enormous nuclear arsenal. We can kill each other and most of the people on the planet several times over. We don't want to use nuclear weapons. I see no evidence that Mr. Putin does. That's kind of a dumb way to look at it. Secondly, we continue to see Russia through the Cold War lens. Everyone keeps acting as though it's a Soviet Union. It's not. Russia is a very different country today. China, people could call it the Communist Party of China, is doing this and this. The Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China is a joke. The Communist Party of China is just an elite organization. A cabal of people across the country that run the government and try to control 1.4 billion people, which is pretty damn difficult to do. They're not communists. I haven't seen very many communists in Northeast Asia whenever I've been over there to visit. The Chinese are money-grabbing people. Let's face it. They are absolutely committed to profit at all costs. So, I don't see much evidence for communism. I see a lot of evidence for capitalism. But I don't see evidence for Chinese armies massing on anybody's border to invade anybody. And when they look at their naval power, remember a third of all the ships that they have floating around in the South China Sea are Coast Guard vessels. So, all right, what are we really dealing with? Are we genuinely facing existential threats from China and Russia? And I think the president said it very well last night. He said no. He said our problems are here at home. And they are. So, you have this group of people in Washington who seem to be ready to do anything to sustain these massive outlays in spending. Not just defense, but also in entitlements, as you know. And we continue to pretend as though the Social Security system, Medicare, Medicaid, pension plans, these things are solid. They're not. We know they're not. We pretend that the banks are solvent and not illiquid. They're not. I mean, these Riverback. I think it was December or November last year. All of these, what was it? Stress tests were run on banks. Oh well, we're in pretty good shape. That wasn't true. Right. We are continuing to mislead ourselves in order to sustain this tremendous spending. Well, when does it stop? I think it was Ben Stein who said, things go on until they can't. When did the British leave India? When their debt-to-GDP ratio was 240%? In other words, I'm afraid that the so-called ruling elites in Washington, D.C. are just going to drive us into the ground. And I hope that before then, if I have to choose between hyperinflation and default in terms of restructuring the debt, I'd rather go with the restructuring as opposed to hyperinflation. But they're all going to be painful. And no one wants to tell the American people the truth. Just as these documents have come out and told us we're losing in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are not going to win. Ukraine is being destroyed. We have the same problem at home. Our financial system is being destroyed by us. It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners. All right, now to my first partner where I buy my Bitcoin, Swan. I partnered with Swan because it is a Bitcoin-only company focused on helping people save for their future and self-custody their Bitcoin, not trade it. You can start a direct deposit to take advantage of Bitcoin as a savings technology and learn how to take it off the exchange. Swan's mission is to educate 10 million future Bitcoiners through free resources and media projects like Hard Money. Swan also offers retirement planning with an IRA, tax loss harvesting, home equity conversion, and a white-glove private client service. I use Swan to dollar cost average every day. That's right. I deposit a little bit every day that's equivalent to what I might spend on a meal so that I add to my future nest day and lower my yearly cost basis. To learn more and get $10 in free Bitcoin when you sign up, head to swanbitcoin.com/Natalie Brunell. Next up, Fold is the best Bitcoin rewards debit card and shopping app in the world. You can earn Bitcoin on everything you purchase from Amazon to groceries to sprucing up your wardrobe with Fold's Bitcoin Cashback debit card. And you can win free Satoshis every day or even play for the chance to win a whole Bitcoin by spinning the daily wheel and the purchase rewards wheel. And now on Fold, you can buy Bitcoin directly and earn even more incentives and rewards by using the app to stack sats. It's an amazing app to get someone totally new in the Bitcoin. So if you want to join the fun, head to foldapp.com/Natalie and get 10,000 in free Satoshis when you sign up. Well, let's talk a little bit more about China. First of all, what do you make of the meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Emmanuel Macron of France, and what does that mean for geopolitics given everything you've just covered? Well, when you see President Xi, stop thinking about communism, forget that, and think of him as the contemporary emperor of China. China is an empire unto itself, much as we are on the North American continent, frankly. But China is an imperial state, not with goals and objectives to conquer the world because they've got 1.4 billion people, they've got enough. You know, as a Japanese commander after a couple of years in China in the 1930s turned to the emperor and said, you know, the in China is there's nothing in it but Chinese. In other words, what are we doing here? This is crazy, and the Japanese were trying to get out. The point is that she looks at Macron and sees Macron as a potential trading partner. Remember, China's focus is on the restoration of this thing called the Silk Road. Right. And you have several sort of lines of communication that run across the map. They all run through Central Asia. Some run down south through what we used to call Persia, Iran, or in Turkey and in the Middle East, but most of them really are from Northeast Asia, from Shanghai to Beijing all the way to France on the Atlantic coast. Now, why is this so important? It's important because we have the most powerful submarine fleet in the world. We may have a shrinking surface fleet, but surface fleets don't fight battles and win wars the way they did 100, 200 years ago. Today, everything is a function of the submarine at sea, its ability to neutralize you, put you out of business. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out of a port if we decide to put a submarine out there at sea, and you have the overhead surveillance which is connected to everything on the ground and connected to all sorts of platforms. So, this is readily available as a tool for us. If we decided to shut down Chinese ports, we could do it. China knows that and has known that for a very long time. They went through this with the Royal Navy back in the 1840s and even earlier. So, what if the Chinese concluded? Well, we need to bypass the maritime route to the extent that we can, and they're very dependent on it. They will be for many years to come through the Strait of Malacca up into the South China Sea. Food, energy through that strait up into China. But if you build this network across Central Asia that reaches to Europe, that's a game changer. Because Russia has all the energy in the world that you could possibly need. So if you're suddenly cut off, you've got it. Russia has most of the food that you're going to need to eat as well, along with Ukraine. You look at that entire area. It's a food production center on a scale that very few people in the West appreciate. There's a reason, and we used to call it Ukraine the breadbasket of Europe. So the bottom line is this is a very important development, this One Belt One Road project. And the Europeans, of course, want to trade with China. Well, why wouldn't they? I mean, China's the biggest market in the world, or one of the biggest. This is inevitable. And we're sitting there trying to stop it. Are we nuts? The answer is yes, of course. But we've also missed our opportunity because we have an advantage over the Chinese. When the Chinese try to move across Central Asia, they've got to go through multiple countries, multiple states where people speak multiple languages, have different laws and customs, and as you move through each state, everybody has their hand out and says, please, it's money, please, because you're going to go through this. We have missed the opportunity to build something right across North America from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. We could outpace China or anybody else in Asia anytime we wanted to if we had fast sea lift in the Pacific, fast sea lift in the Atlantic, and trains right across North America. And what else? It's secure. One language, one law, one people, one nation. Faster, cheaper, better. What have we done? Nothing. It looks like instead we're just moving in that same direction of more intimidation, raising tensions. You've said in interviews before that China doesn't want war with us and that our leaders in Washington do not understand the priorities of leaders like Xi, their cultures, their people. So what do you think should happen next versus what do you think happened and what's really at stake here with China? Well, what we should. Let's talk about what we should understand about both Taiwan and China because they both have the same aspirations, the same goals, frankly. Chinese everywhere want to live in a society, in a state, in a world that looks like Singapore. Now, what's interesting about Singapore? Well, most Americans would go to Singapore, look around and live there for a couple of days, be horrified. Everything in Singapore is really controlled by the government. You know, you're not just going to show up in Singapore, buy 20 acres and build something. Effectively, the government leases everything to you, and they have very strict laws and regulations governing everything, but what do they not do? Well, they don't tax you to death per SE. In other words, if you're wealthy enough to get there to begin with, they're not going to steal it from you, but they provide you with a marketplace, whereas from the Chinese vantage point, which is ideal. No one interferes with you. No one bothers you. You have the freedom to enrich yourself. And that's very important to most Chinese. Remember, China is a part of the world where people have died by the billions from all sorts of famines and problems over many, many centuries. They just want to live unencumbered by the government and do business. Now they also have a huge problem with corruption, much greater than we in the United States understand. Someone told me the other day they estimated that on Taiwan alone there are probably 100 gangsters with connections to Japan, Korea, and China. So the corruption is a huge problem. And Xi may control many things, but he can't even control the corruption inside China. He can't stop everything from moving on any given day. I mean, he's limited just by the size and scope of the country. So the point is no, they don't want war with anybody. They just want to do business, but the Singapore model is really what both Taiwanese and Chinese want. Now, we can't conceive of that. So, we project our views, our values, our mentality onto them, and the outcome is this utterly misleading view that China is armed to the teeth and can't wait to invade Taiwan. For your listeners out there, look, Taiwan is hell to invade. They have very few beaches where you can land. And they're very small. You're talking about sheer rock face around most of the island's edges. It's very difficult to reach, difficult to get on board, and by the way, the Chinese don't want to destroy what's on Taiwan. They want to do business with it. They have investments there, and the Taiwanese are heavily invested in China. So, all of this war business just needs to stop, and I think if we shut up and get out of the way, this will sort itself out over the next several years, but in Asia, of course, things take time. We're the instant pudding world, which is insane. We want everything immediately. In Asia, it may be 10 years, maybe 20 years. She said that they were looking at 2040 or 2043 or 2046 as reunification with the people on Taiwan. It would probably happen. I've been breeding,